They said Sarah Chen was mentally unfit to serve, but the thousands of sailors aboard the USS Constellation had no idea that the quiet woman mopping their corridors at 0400 hours possessed the technical knowledge to save their lives when catastrophe struck. What the Navy brass didn't know was that Petty Officer Third Class Sarah Chen, now relegated to janitorial duties and psychiatric evaluation, had once been Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the most brilliant nuclear engineer in the Pacific Fleet. Fluorescent lights of Deck 7 cast harsh shadows as Sarah pushed her mop bucket through the endless maze of corridors that formed the bowels of the USS Constellation. At 31, her black hair hung loose around her shoulders, a stark contrast to the regulation bun she'd worn during her 8 years as a commissioned officer. The dark circles under her brown eyes told the story of sleepless nights filled with memories that psychiatric evaluations had labeled as severe post-traumatic stress disorder with associated psychotic episodes. The official diagnosis had become her scarlet letter, marking her as damaged goods in an institution that prized mental toughness above all else. Her current uniform consisted of faded coveralls bearing the name Shun stitched in block letters above her left breast pocket. No rank insignia, no ribbons, no indication that she had once held security clearances so high that even admirals couldn't access some of the programs she'd overseen. The transformation from nuclear engineer to custodial staff had taken 18 months of bureaucratic machinery grinding away at her career, her reputation, and her sense of self-worth. Now she existed in the invisible world of support personnel, present but unacknowledged, essential but unrecognized. The USS Constellation, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, housed over 5,000 souls during deployment operations. As Sarah worked her way through the labyrinthine passageways, she passed sailors heading to early morning watch stations, their conversations a mix of technical jargon and casual banter. None of them looked at her directly. Custodial staff occupied a social blind spot in the rigid hierarchy of naval life. She had learned to appreciate this invisibility, finding a strange comfort in anonymity after months of being scrutinized by psychiatrists, review boards, and superior officers who saw only her breakdown, never the brilliant mind that had preceded it. The reactor compartment access corridor required special cleaning protocols due to its proximity to the ship's nuclear power plant. Sarah's hands moved with unconscious precision as she followed procedures that had been drilled into maintenance staff, but her mind wandered to more complex matters. She could hear the subtle vibrations of the reactor cooling pumps, feel the barely perceptible tremor in the deck plating that indicated normal operations. These sensations meant nothing to the other custodial workers, but to Sarah they were a symphony of information about the ship's most critical systems. Her knowledge of nuclear propulsion went far beyond what any maintenance worker should possess. During her tenure as a commissioned officer, she had overseen the design and implementation of safety protocols for the Navy's newest reactor systems. Her doctoral dissertation on thermodynamics in pressurized water reactors had been classified at the highest levels, its insights forming the foundation for improvements across the entire nuclear fleet. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now cleaned the corridors outside the very compartments where her innovations kept thousands of people safe. The morning shift change brought increased foot traffic through the passages Sarah was cleaning. Young sailors hurried past, their minds focused on upcoming duties and responsibilities. Occasionally, she caught fragments of conversation about reactor performance metrics or cooling system anomalies, technical discussions that sparked her professional instincts despite her current circumstances. She forced herself to maintain focus on her assigned tasks, knowing that any display of technical knowledge beyond her supposed station would draw unwanted attention. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez approached from the direction of the reactor compartment, his weathered face showing the strain of a 26-year career in nuclear operations. He nodded politely to Sarah as he passed, one of the few senior enlisted personnel who acknowledged custodial staff with basic courtesy. Rodriguez had no way of knowing that the woman mopping floors possessed more technical expertise than most of his reactor technicians, or that her insights could identify problems that escaped conventional diagnostic procedures. The psychiatric evaluation that had ended Sarah's career as an officer stemmed from an incident during her final deployment. As Lieutenant Commander, she had been serving as the nuclear propulsion officer aboard the USS Enterprise when a catastrophic failure in the primary cooling system had threatened reactor containment. Her unconventional solution, bypassing standard protocols to prevent a potential meltdown, had saved the ship and its crew, but violated numerous regulations in the process. The stress of the emergency, combined with the weight of responsibility for preventing a nuclear disaster, had triggered what psychiatrists later classified as a psychotic break. Her testimony during the subsequent investigation had been dismissed as the ramblings of an officer suffering from severe mental distress. Claims about hearing the reactors speak to her, about sensing irregularities in system performance through subtle environmental cues, had been interpreted as hallucinations, rather than the intuitive understanding that came from years of intimate knowledge of nuclear systems. The review board's final recommendation had been immediate removal from nuclear duties, reduction in rank, and assignment to non-critical positions, pending comprehensive psychiatric treatment. The cleaning carts squeaked slightly as Sarah maneuvered it around a corner, the sound echoing off the metal bulkheads that formed the ship's interior skeleton. She had learned to find meditation in the repetitive motions of her work, using the physical routine to quiet the chaos that sometimes erupted in her mind when memories of the Enterprise incident surfaced. The prescribed medications helped control the most severe symptoms, but they also dulled the edge of perception that had once made her exceptional at her profession. Dr. Margaret Vance, the ship's chief psychiatric officer, conducted weekly sessions with Sarah in a small office tucked away in the medical department. These meetings followed a predictable pattern. Dr. Vance would ask about symptoms, medication compliance, and social adjustment, while Sarah provided carefully measured responses, designed to demonstrate stability without revealing the depth of her ongoing awareness of the ship's technical systems. The psychiatrist meant well, but she operated from a framework that pathologized Sarah's unique perceptual abilities rather than recognizing them as professional expertise. The irony of her situation crystallized during these sessions. Dr. Vance would discuss Sarah's obsession with technical details and her delusional belief that she could diagnose problems with complex systems through subtle sensory input. The psychiatrist saw these traits as symptoms to be managed rather than capabilities to be valued. Sarah had learned to nod appropriately and speak in terms of moving forward and letting go of the past, while inwardly maintaining her understanding of how the ship's most critical systems actually functioned. Fellow custodial workers treated Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. They knew something about her background that set her apart from typical maintenance personnel, though the specifics remained classified. Maria Santos, a civilian contractor responsible for galley cleaning, had become something approaching a friend through their shared early morning shifts. Maria's kindness came without judgment, offering simple human connection that Sarah had found increasingly rare since her psychiatric diagnosis became part of her official record. The ship's daily routine provided structure that Sarah found comforting. Despite the monotony, morning cleaning duties were followed by equipment maintenance tasks that occasionally required her to work near technical systems she understood far better than her supervisors realized. She had developed a careful balance of competence without excellence, performing her assigned duties well enough to avoid negative attention while suppressing the instincts that had once made her one of the Navy's most promising nuclear engineers. Command Master Chief Patricia Williams, the ship's senior enlisted advisor, maintained a professional distance from all custodial staff, but Sarah had noticed the woman's careful observation during the past several weeks. Williams possessed the kind of institutional knowledge and people-reading skills that came from decades of naval service, and Sarah suspected that the Command Master Chief had formed opinions about her background that went beyond what appeared. In her current service record, the weight of her hidden knowledge created a constant internal tension. Every day brought encounters with technical discussions, system diagnostics, and operational decisions that she could improve or optimize if given the opportunity. Instead, she pushed her mop cart through corridors while listening to junior technicians struggle with problems she could solve in minutes. The psychiatric establishment had concluded that her technical insights were symptomatic of mental illness, creating a catch-22 where demonstrating her expertise would be interpreted as evidence of her unfitness for duty. Late-night shifts provided the most peaceful moments of Sarah's current existence. The ship operated with reduced personnel during these hours, allowing her to work with minimal social interaction, while the mechanical sounds of the carrier's operations provided a familiar backdrop. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the flight deck operations above, the subtle changes in engine noise that indicated aircraft launching and recovering, the vibrations that spoke of organized chaos managed through precise coordination. Her small berthing compartment, shared with 3 other junior enlisted personnel, offered little privacy but sufficient space for the few personal possessions she had retained from her previous life. Hidden beneath her regulation bedding lay a small notebook containing technical observations and system analyses that she continued to compile despite knowing that discovery would likely result in additional psychiatric evaluation. The compulsion to understand and document technical information had proven stronger than the institutional pressure to abandon her professional identity. The notebook contained detailed observations about the Constellation's nuclear propulsion systems based on environmental cues that other personnel couldn't detect or interpret. Subtle variations in background radiation levels, barely perceptible changes in mechanical vibrations, thermal signatures that painted pictures of system performance, invisible to conventional monitoring equipment. These insights, dismissed as delusions by psychiatric evaluators, represented the kind of intuitive technical understanding that had once made her invaluable to the nuclear Navy. As Sarah completed her assigned cleaning tasks and prepared to secure her equipment for the day, she had no awareness that her carefully constructed invisibility was about to be shattered by events that would test every aspect of her hidden expertise. The USS Constellation was sailing toward a convergence of circumstances that would transform her from a mentally unfit custodial worker into the only person capable of preventing a disaster that could claim thousands of lives. Commander Jackson Blake strode through the corridors of the USS Constellation with the unmistakable bearing of a man who had never questioned his right to command. At 42, he possessed the kind of sharp features and steel-gray eyes that conveyed authority even in casual conversation, though his interactions with subordinates rarely qualified as casual. His dress uniform bore the ribbons of someone who had advanced through the ranks with calculated precision, each promotion timed to maximize career advancement rather than operational necessity. Unlike officers who had earned their positions through technical expertise or combat leadership, Blake's ascension reflected his mastery of naval politics and his family's 3-generation legacy of flag rank officers. The morning briefing. The ship's operations center buzzed with the controlled energy of senior staff preparing for another day of exercises in the South Pacific. Blake commanded attention effortlessly, his voice cutting through ambient noise with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. His position as executive officer made him the second most powerful person aboard the Constellation, responsible for the daily operations that kept the massive vessel functioning as an instrument of American naval power. He wore this responsibility like a perfectly tailored uniform, visible to everyone and designed to impress. Blake's attitude toward enlisted personnel reflected the institutional arrogance that had characterized his entire career. In his worldview, Officers were the thinking class, while enlisted sailors existed to execute orders without question or independent thought. This perspective had served him well during assignments where political connections mattered more than operational competence. But it had also created blind spots that more experienced officers recognized as dangerous. His dismissive treatment of senior enlisted advisors had earned him enemies among the chief petty officers who actually understood how ships functioned, though none possessed sufficient rank to challenge his authority directly. The nuclear propulsion department fell under Blake's oversight, a responsibility that would have terrified most officers given the catastrophic potential of reactor accidents. Blake approached nuclear operations with the same superficial confidence he brought to all technical matters, trusting that his Princeton education and family connections provided adequate preparation for managing systems he understood only in theoretical terms. His technical briefings focused on procedural compliance rather than genuine comprehension, an approach that satisfied regulatory requirements while failing to address the subtle realities of nuclear engineering. Chief Petty Officer Mike Patterson, the ship's senior reactor technician, represented everything Blake found irritating about enlisted personnel who forgot their place in the naval hierarchy. Patterson's 22 years of nuclear experience had taught him to recognize potential problems through instincts developed over decades of hands-on technical work. His attempts to brief Blake on reactor performance anomalies were consistently met with impatience and dismissal, the commander making clear that he had no interest in details that didn't appear in standardized reports. "Chief Patterson," Blake announced during the morning technical briefing, his tone carrying the edge of someone addressing a particularly slow child. "I don't need your folk wisdom about reactor operations. We have instruments and procedures for monitoring system performance. Your job is to follow established protocols, not to play nuclear engineer based on hunches and feelings." Patterson's weathered face remained professionally neutral despite the insult, years of military discipline suppressing his natural reaction to Blake's condescension. The other technicians in the briefing room exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of an executive officer who valued theoretical knowledge over practical experience. Blake either failed to notice these nonverbal communications or simply didn't care about the opinions of personnel he considered intellectually inferior. The ship's custodial staff occupied an even lower position in Blake's mental hierarchy, existing as invisible background figures who perform necessary but menial tasks. He had never bothered to learn their names or acknowledge their presence beyond occasional complaints about cleaning schedules that interfered with his daily routine. When Sarah Chen cleaned the corridors outside his stateroom, Blake looked through her as if she were part of the ship's equipment rather than a human being deserving basic courtesy. Blake's treatment of female personnel reflected attitudes that had somehow survived decades of integration and equal opportunity policies. He spoke to women officers with barely concealed condescension, constantly questioning their technical competence while never applying the same scrutiny to male colleagues with similar or inferior qualifications. His interactions with enlisted women were even more dismissive, combining gender bias with class prejudice in ways that created hostile working environments for anyone unfortunate enough to serve under his command. Dr. Margaret Vance had attempted to discuss personnel issues with Blake during their monthly meetings, specifically addressing concerns about his impact on ship morale and unit cohesion. Blake dismissed these conversations as the concerns of a civilian contractor who failed to understand military culture and the necessity of maintaining proper authority relationships. His attitude toward the ship's psychiatric staff reflected his broader skepticism about mental health services, which he viewed as expensive accommodations for personnel who lacked the fortitude for military service. "Dr. Vance," Blake had explained during their most recent meeting, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he reserved for civilians, "the military isn't a therapy group. We have standards and expectations that don't accommodate every individual's emotional needs. Personnel who can't meet those standards should find other careers, not expect the Navy to lower its requirements to accommodate their limitations. Executive officers' quarters reflected his sense of personal importance, decorated with photographs that documented his career progression and family connections rather than operational achievements. Blake spent considerable time each day maintaining correspondence with Pentagon officials and congressional staff members who could influence his promotion prospects. These political relationships represented his most valuable asset, providing protection from accountability that would have ended the careers of officers. Without similar connections, Blake's daily routine included inspections designed more to demonstrate his authority than to address genuine operational concerns. He moved through the ship's spaces with an entourage of junior officers whose primary function was to provide an audience for his pronouncements on naval policy and leadership philosophy. These tours avoided technical areas where his lack of genuine expertise might become apparent, focusing instead on ceremonial spaces, where his presence would be noted and reported through official channels. The reactor compartment remained largely outside Blake's direct oversight, a situation that suited both his preferences and the recommendations of senior technical personnel who recognized his limitations. Chief Patterson and his team managed nuclear operations with minimal interference from the executive officer, an arrangement that had functioned adequately during routine operations but had never been tested under emergency conditions. Blake's confidence in this system reflected his broader assumption that military organizations could function effectively through strict adherence to established procedures regardless of individual competence. Nuclear safety protocols required Blake's approval for any significant changes to reactor operations, a responsibility that made him nervous despite his outward confidence. His approach to these decisions involved deferring to whatever recommendations appeared in official technical reports, while avoiding detailed discussions that might reveal his superficial understanding of nuclear engineering principles. This strategy had worked successfully during his previous assignments, though none had involved the level of technical complexity represented by the Constellation's propulsion systems. The ship's Command Master Chief, Patricia Williams, maintained a careful professional relationship with Blake, despite her private concerns about his leadership style. Williams had served under enough executive officers to recognize the type: politically connected, personally ambitious, and dangerously overconfident about their technical abilities. Her attempts to provide guidance about enlisted personnel management were met with polite dismissal, Blake making clear that he considered such advice beneath his need for input. Blake's attitude toward safety procedures reflected his broader approach to military service. Compliance with regulations was sufficient to prevent problems, and excessive caution represented a lack of confidence in established systems. This perspective had served him well in administrative assignments where the consequences of mistakes were measured in paperwork rather than lives. The transition to operational commands had never forced him to confront the limitations of this approach, since his previous assignments had been carefully selected to minimize risk to his career advancement. The morning's intelligence briefing included routine updates about regional tensions and potential threats to naval operations in the South Pacific. Blake processed this information with the detached interest of someone whose primary concern was ensuring that his command tour concluded without incidents that could damage his promotion prospects. The possibility of actual combat or emergency situations remained theoretical abstractions, rather than genuine concerns requiring preparation and planning. Junior officers who served under Blake quickly learned to anticipate his preferences and manage information flow to avoid triggering his impatience with technical details. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the ship's communications officer, had developed strategies for presenting complex information in simplified formats that satisfied Blake's need to appear informed without overwhelming him with details he couldn't fully comprehend. This accommodation enabled smooth daily operations while creating systemic vulnerabilities that more experienced commanders would have recognized and addressed. Blake's relationship with the ship's captain reflected the complex dynamics of senior naval leadership, where personal relationships often mattered more than professional competence. Captain Reynolds, nearing retirement after a distinguished career, had learned to work around his executive officer's limitations while maintaining the fiction of Blake's competence for the sake of unit cohesion. This delicate balance required constant management and had created an environment where serious problems might be overlooked or minimized to avoid confronting Blake's deficiencies. The executive officer's treatment of medical personnel extended beyond Dr. Vance to include the ship's hospital corpsmen and other healthcare providers. Blake viewed medical concerns as potential obstacles to operational efficiency rather than legitimate issues requiring attention and resources. His approach to personnel health problems involved minimal accommodation and maximum pressure to return to duty, regardless of underlying medical realities or long-term consequences for individual sailors. Crew evaluations under Blake's leadership consistently emphasized compliance and attitude over technical competence or innovative thinking. Personnel who questioned procedures or suggested improvements were labeled as troublemakers regardless of the merit of their contributions. This approach had gradually created an environment where junior personnel learned to avoid initiative and focus exclusively on avoiding negative attention from their superiors. The ship's nuclear safety committee met monthly to review procedures and address potential concerns about reactor operations. Blake's participation in these meetings was perfunctory. His attention focused on ensuring that required paperwork was completed rather than engaging with substantive technical discussions. Chief Patterson and other senior technicians had learned to conduct their real business before and after official meetings, knowing that Blake's presence would stifle genuine technical exchange. Blake's confidence in his authority had grown steadily throughout his assignment aboard the Constellation, reinforced by successful completion of routine operations and the absence of major incidents that might have exposed his limitations. This overconfidence would soon be tested by circumstances that demanded genuine technical leadership rather than bureaucratic management, situations where political connections and family influence would prove irrelevant to survival. The morning inspection tour that Blake conducted through the ship's engineering spaces provided opportunities for him to demonstrate his authority while avoiding detailed technical discussions that might reveal his superficial understanding of complex systems. His comments during these tours focused on cleanliness, organization, and compliance with uniform regulations rather than operational efficiency or technical innovation. The personnel being inspected had learned to present information in ways that satisfied Blake's need to appear knowledgeable without requiring genuine technical engagement. As Blake concluded his daily routine and prepared for the afternoon's scheduled activities, he remained completely unaware that his dismissive leadership style and technical incompetence were about to be tested by a crisis that would demand exactly the kind of expertise he had spent his career avoiding. The convergence of his arrogance with circumstances requiring genuine technical leadership would create conditions where his limitations could no longer be hidden behind political connections and bureaucratic procedures. The pattern of dismissal that defined Sarah's existence aboard the USS Constellation had crystallized into a daily routine of systematic invisibility, punctuated by moments of casual cruelty that reminded her of her diminished status. Commander Blake's interactions with custodial staff followed a predictable script. He would approach areas being cleaned with visible impatience, make pointed comments about efficiency and proper procedures, and deliver dismissive remarks designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that placed him at the apex and maintenance workers at the bottom. The first incident occurred during Sarah's third week aboard the Constellation while she was cleaning the corridor outside the nuclear engineering Office. Blake emerged from a briefing with Chief Patterson, his face showing the irritation that typically followed technical discussions that challenged his superficial understanding of reactor operations. Sarah was methodically mopping the deck when Blake nearly stepped into her cleaning bucket. His attention focused on a tablet displaying operational reports rather than his immediate surroundings. "Watch where you're putting that equipment," Blake snapped, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone looking for a target for his frustration. "Some of us have important work to do without dodging cleaning supplies scattered across the passageways." Sarah immediately moved the bucket against the bulkhead and stepped back to provide clear passage, her response automatic after months of similar encounters. "Sorry, sir, I'll keep the area clear," she replied quietly, maintaining the deferential tone. That had become second nature during her tenure as custodial staff. Blake paused in his retreat, something in Sarah's voice or posture triggering his instinct for finding weakness to exploit. "What's your name, sailor?" he demanded, though his question was rhetorical since he had no intention of remembering the answer. The inquiry was purely about asserting dominance over someone who couldn't challenge his authority. "Chen, sir. Petty Officer 3rd Class Chen." "Well, Chen, when you're finished playing with your mop, try to remember that operational spaces require different standards than the galley or berthing areas. We can't have custodial staff interfering with critical ship functions because they don't understand the importance of what happens here." The irony of Blake's lecture wasn't lost on Sarah, who understood the nuclear engineering systems being discussed behind the office door better than Blake himself. She nodded appropriately and returned to her cleaning while Blake continued his progress through the corridor, satisfied that he had reinforced proper relationships between officers and enlisted personnel. The second confrontation escalated Blake's pattern of casual dominance into something approaching personal vendetta. Sarah was assigned to clean the officers' wardroom during the afternoon meal period, working around senior staff who continued their discussions of operational matters, while she emptied trash receptacles and wiped down surfaces. The conversation centered on reactor performance metrics and maintenance schedules, technical details that Blake addressed with the kind of confident ignorance that characterized his approach to complex systems. The cooling system efficiency. Reports show normal parameters across all monitored systems, Blake announced to the assembled officers, reading directly from a prepared summary that reduced complex engineering data to simplified bullet points. Chief Patterson continues to express concerns about minor variations in thermal output, but these fall well within acceptable ranges according to regulatory standards. Lieutenant Commander Torres, the ship's engineering officer, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Blake dismissed concerns that had been keeping the engineering staff awake at night. "Sir, the variations that Chief Patterson identified might indicate developing problems that could become serious if we don't address them proactively. His experience with these systems suggests we should investigate further." Blake's response demonstrated his characteristic inability to distinguish between regulatory compliance and operational safety. "Commander Torres, we follow established procedures for reactor monitoring. If the instruments indicate normal operations, we don't chase imaginary problems based on the hunches of enlisted personnel. That's how we maintain discipline and avoid unnecessary complications." Sarah's hands stilled on the cloth she was using to clean nearby surfaces as she listened to Blake dismiss legitimate safety concerns through bureaucratic inflexibility. The thermal variations Torres was describing matched patterns she had observed through environmental cues that wouldn't register on conventional monitoring equipment. Her training and experience screamed warnings about potential cascade failures that could develop from the symptoms being ignored, but her current status made any intervention impossible. Blake noticed Sarah's momentary pause in her cleaning routine and interpreted it as eavesdropping on conversations above her security clearance and social station. "Chen, do you have business in this compartment other than cleaning?" His question carried implicit threat. suggesting that custodial staff, who lingered near officer discussions, might be suspected of gathering intelligence for improper purposes. "No, sir, just finishing the assigned cleaning tasks," Sarah replied, forcing herself to resume the mechanical motions of wiping surfaces while her mind processed the technical information she had overheard. The conversation continued around her as if she had ceased to exist, officers discussing reactor operations while the person most qualified to address their concerns pushed a cleaning cart toward the exit. The third incident revealed the personal satisfaction Blake derived from humiliating personnel he perceived as inferior. Sarah was assigned to clean the ship's technical library, a small compartment containing reference materials and computer terminals used by engineering personnel for research and system analysis. Blake discovered her there during an unscheduled inspection, ostensibly checking on space utilization, but actually looking for opportunities to demonstrate his authority. "What exactly are you doing in here, Chen?" Blake's tone suggested he had discovered her committing some form of misconduct rather than performing assigned duties. The technical library was included in her cleaning rotation, but Blake's question implied that custodial staff had no legitimate business in spaces associated with intellectual work. "Cleaning and organizing the reference materials, sir. The duty roster has this space scheduled for weekly maintenance." Sarah gestured toward the cleaning supplies and the neat stacks of technical manuals she had been dusting, evidence of legitimate work that Blake chose to interpret suspiciously. Blake moved closer to examine her work, his proximity designed to intimidate rather than inspect. "These are classified technical references. Chen, do you understand the security implications of unauthorized personnel handling sensitive materials?" His accusation was completely unfounded since custodial staff were specifically cleared for access to all spaces they were assigned to clean. But the suggestion of security violations carried serious implications for Sarah's already precarious status. "Yes, sir, I understand the security requirements. I'm only cleaning the surfaces and reorganizing materials that were left scattered." Sarah's response was carefully neutral, avoiding any indication that she was actually reading or comprehending the technical content that surrounded her daily work. Blake picked up a manual on reactor safety protocols, holding it as evidence of Sarah's supposed transgression. "Do you have any idea what this material contains, Chen? Do you understand the level of training and education required to work with these systems?" His questions were designed to highlight the intellectual gap he assumed existed between officers and enlisted personnel, particularly those relegated to custodial duties. Sarah faced a moment of terrible choice. She could demonstrate her comprehensive understanding of the material Blake was holding, risking exposure of her background and probable psychiatric evaluation, or she could maintain her cover by appearing ignorant of subjects she had helped develop. The weight of her hidden knowledge pressed against the necessity of continued anonymity. "No, sir, I don't understand the technical details. I just clean whatever spaces I'm assigned." The lie came easier than she had expected, years of concealing her expertise having taught her to suppress the professional pride that had once defined her identity. Blake's smile carried genuine satisfaction at what he interpreted as confirmation of his superiority over intellectually inferior personnel. "That's right, Chen. These materials require advanced technical education and security clearances that take years to obtain. Custodial staff should focus on cleaning and leave the thinking to people qualified for complex responsibilities." The dismissal stung more than Sarah had anticipated, not because Blake's opinion mattered, but because it represented the systematic devaluation of expertise that had characterized her entire experience since the psychiatric diagnosis. Blake had no way of knowing that the woman he was lecturing had contributed to the development of some of the very protocols he was using to demonstrate her supposed ignorance. Dr. Vance witnessed the fourth incident during one of her routine tours through ship spaces, observing Blake's interaction with Sarah from a distance that allowed her to assess the dynamics without direct involvement. Blake was berating Sarah for cleaning procedures in a technical workspace, his voice carrying clearly through the corridor as he explained why custodial staff needed constant supervision to perform even simple tasks correctly. The problem with personnel at your level, Chen, is that you don't understand the broader implications of your work. You see cleaning as just moving dirt around, but in technical spaces, improper procedures can contaminate sensitive equipment or interfere with critical operations. That's why you need detailed instructions and constant oversight. Dr. Vance observed Sarah's body language during Blake's lecture, noting the controlled tension that suggested suppressed emotional responses rather than the passive acceptance that Blake interpreted as appropriate deference. The psychiatrist had worked with enough military personnel to recognize the signs of someone enduring systematic humiliation while maintaining professional composure. Through extraordinary self-discipline, Sarah's response to Blake's criticism followed the pattern she had established in previous encounters: acknowledgement of his authority, acceptance of his characterization of her capabilities, and commitment to improve performance according to his standards. Yes, sir, I'll pay closer attention to the specific requirements for technical spaces. Thank you for the guidance. Blake's satisfaction with Sarah's response reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of leadership and human motivation. He interpreted compliance as evidence of successful authority, rather than recognizing the corrosive effects of systematic demoralization on unit cohesion and individual performance. His approach to personnel management had created an environment where competent individuals learned to hide their abilities to avoid additional responsibility without corresponding recognition or authority. The pattern of escalating dismissal reached its peak during a general quarters drill that brought the entire crew to battle stations. Sarah's assignment during these exercises was to secure custodial equipment and report to damage control stations, where her technical background, though unrecognized, made her more valuable than her superiors realized. Blake used the drill as an opportunity to demonstrate command presence by touring battle stations and providing commentary on crew performance. Chen, what's your function during general quarters? Blake's question came as Sarah was securing chemical cleaning supplies that could become hazardous during combat operations. His tone suggested that he expected her role to be minimal and easily explained. Damage control party, sir. Secondary assignment to DC Central for technical support. Sarah's response was accurate but deliberately vague, avoiding mention of her specific qualifications for technical assessment and emergency repair procedures. Blake nodded with the satisfaction of someone confirming his expectations about the PAVI limited capabilities of enlisted personnel. Good. Follow instructions from the damage control chief and stay out of the way of personnel handling complex technical tasks. Emergency situations require people who understand sophisticated systems, not just basic cleaning procedures. The dismissal crystallized everything wrong with Blake's leadership philosophy: his assumption that current assignment determined capability, his inability to recognize hidden expertise among his personnel, and his conviction that military rank corresponded directly to technical competence. Sarah accepted his characterization silently while mentally noting that her emergency technical qualifications exceeded those of most officers aboard the ship, including Blake himself. As the drill concluded and normal operations resumed, Sarah returned to her custodial duties with the growing awareness that Blake's systematic dismissal of her capabilities was creating dangerous blind spots in the ship's operational readiness. His pattern of humiliation had transformed from personal irritation into a potential threat to ship safety, since emergency situations might require exactly the kind of technical expertise he was determined to suppress and ignore. The crisis that would test every assumption about competence and authority aboard the USS Constellation began with what appeared to be a routine training exercise. Admiral Richardson's directive had arrived through encrypted channels 3 days earlier, mandating participation in Operation Steel Thunder, a multi-carrier group exercise designed to test fleet readiness under simulated combat conditions. The exercise would push the Constellation's nuclear propulsion systems to maximum operational capacity, while conducting sustained flight operations in challenging sea conditions. Commander Blake viewed the exercise as an opportunity to demonstrate his command capabilities to visiting Pentagon officials who would be observing operations from the flag bridge. His preparation focused primarily on ensuring that ceremonial aspects of the exercise proceeded flawlessly, with particular attention to briefing presentations and the visual impression created by crew performance during inspection tours. The technical complexities of extended high-power reactor operations received minimal consideration in his planning, relegated to subordinate staff who Blake assumed could handle routine engineering challenges without senior officer involvement. Chief Patterson's concerns about conducting maximum power operations with the thermal anomalies he had been tracking for weeks were dismissed during the pre-exercise briefing, with Blake's characteristic impatience. "Chief, we have regulatory approval for these power levels and established procedures for monitoring reactor performance. Your job is to execute the exercise plan, not to second-guess decisions made by people with broader operational perspectives." The exercise scenario called for the Constellation to maintain maximum speed for 72 hours while conducting round-the-clock flight operations, a combination that would stress every system aboard the massive carrier. Sarah's cleaning assignments during the exercise included the engineering spaces, where she would have front-row access to the developing crisis, though her official role limited her to maintaining cleanliness standards while technical personnel managed complex operations. Day 1 of Steel Thunder proceeded according to plan, with reactor output climbing to 95% capacity as the Constellation's 4 propeller shafts drove the ship through heavy Pacific swells at maximum sustainable speed. The flight deck operations above created additional electrical demands as aircraft launched and recovered in rapid succession, pushing the ship's power generation systems to their design limits. Blake monitored progress from the bridge with visible satisfaction, congratulating himself on the smooth execution of a complex operation. Sarah noticed the first signs of developing problems during her evening cleaning rotation through the reactor compartment access areas. The thermal signatures that she could detect through environmental cues showed subtle patterns that differed from normal high-power operations, variations that wouldn't register on conventional monitoring equipment, but indicated potential stress concentrations in critical cooling system components. Her attempts to mention these observations to Chief Patterson were politely dismissed, since custodial staff weren't expected to contribute technical insights during complex operations. The first official indication of problems emerged during the midnight watch change on day 2, when reactor technicians reported fluctuations in cooling system pressure that fell within acceptable parameters but showed concerning trends toward instability. Chief Patterson brought these readings to Blake's attention during the 0200 status briefing, recommending a reduction in reactor power pending investigation of the anomalies. Blake's response reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of nuclear safety protocols and his conviction that exercise objectives took precedence over technical concerns. "Chief, we're 12 hours into a 72-hour exercise with Pentagon officials monitoring our performance. Minor fluctuations in system parameters don't justify deviating from approved operational plans. Continue monitoring and maintain current power levels unless you have clear evidence of imminent system failure." Sarah was cleaning the corridor outside the engineering office when she overheard this exchange, her blood running cold as she recognized the cascade of poor decisions that were creating conditions for catastrophic failure. The pressure variations Patterson was reporting matched theoretical models she had developed during her doctoral research, patterns that indicated thermal stress concentrations that could lead to cooling system ruptures if not addressed immediately. Day 2 brought increasing signs of system stress The conventional monitoring equipment was slow to detect, but that Sarah's heightened awareness registered with growing alarm. The background vibrations from the reactor compartment showed harmonic variations that indicated developing mechanical stress in critical components. The subtle changes in ambient temperature and humidity throughout the engineering spaces painted a picture of thermal imbalances that were approaching dangerous thresholds. Blake's daily inspection tour through engineering spaces on day 2 provided him with opportunities to demonstrate confident leadership while avoiding detailed technical discussions that might reveal his inability to interpret the data being presented. His comments focused on crew appearance and procedural compliance rather than the increasingly concerning technical readings that Chief Patterson was documenting with methodical precision. "Outstanding work, Chief Patterson," Blake announced during his tour of the reactor control room, speaking loudly enough for visiting Pentagon officials to hear his praise. This exercise demonstrates the Constellation's ability to maintain maximum performance under demanding operational conditions. Continue current operations and keep me informed of any significant developments. Patterson's attempt to brief Blake on the developing pressure anomalies was cut short by the commander's impatience with technical details that didn't support his narrative of successful exercise execution. "Chief, I understand you have concerns about minor variations in system performance, but we're executing a planned operation within established parameters. Don't let perfectionism interfere with operational objectives." Sarah's access to engineering spaces during cleaning rotations provided her with a comprehensive picture of developing problems that no single monitoring station could detect. The thermal pattern she observed through environmental cues indicated that cooling system stress was concentrating in areas where conventional sensors provided incomplete coverage. Her technical training screened warnings about potential failure modes that could develop rapidly once critical thresholds were exceeded. The crisis point arrived at 14:30 hours on day 3 when a hairline crack in a primary cooling line began, allowing reactor coolant to escape into the engineering compartment. The initial leak was small enough to avoid triggering automatic safety systems, but large enough to begin reducing cooling efficiency in the reactor core. Chief Patterson detected the anomaly through pressure drop readings and immediately requested permission to reduce reactor power pending investigation. Blake's response to Patterson's emergency request demonstrated every weakness in his leadership philosophy and technical understanding. The exercise was scheduled to conclude in 6 hours with a demonstration of sustained, high-speed operations for Pentagon observers, and he viewed Patterson's concerns as an attempt to sabotage his opportunity for career advancement through successful exercise completion. "Chief Patterson, we have 6 hours remaining in this exercise with senior officials evaluating our performance. I will not authorize power reduction based on minor pressure variations that could be explained by normal operational factors. Continue monitoring and maintain current power levels. If you detect actual evidence of system failure, inform me immediately." Sarah was cleaning in the engineering spaces when she heard Patterson's radio report about the pressure drop and Blake's response denying permission for power reduction. Her technical training immediately identified the catastrophic sequence that was beginning to unfold. Reduced cooling efficiency would increase reactor core temperature, thermal expansion would stress cooling system components further, and the initial crack would propagate rapidly once material stress limits were exceeded. The developing emergency created an impossible situation for Sarah that tested every aspect of her carefully constructed anonymity. She possessed the technical knowledge to prevent a nuclear disaster that could kill thousands of people, but using that knowledge would expose her background and likely result in psychiatric evaluation that would end her ability to help. The choice between maintaining her cover and preventing catastrophic loss of life crystallized into a moment of moral clarity that would define the rest of her existence. Chief Patterson's growing alarm was evident in his increasingly frequent Reports to Blake about cooling system performance. Each update showing deteriorating conditions that demanded immediate intervention. His 22 years of nuclear experience had taught him to recognize the early stages of potential catastrophic failures, but his warnings were consistently dismissed by an executive officer who prioritized exercise completion over reactor safety. Sir, the cooling system pressure has dropped another 3% in the last 30 minutes, Patterson reported during his 1500 status update. We're approaching the point where automatic safety systems will initiate emergency shutdown procedures. I strongly recommend reducing power immediately to prevent potential core damage. Blake's impatience with Patterson's persistent warnings had evolved into active hostility toward what he perceived as insubordination, disguised as technical concerns. Chief, you've been predicting disaster for 3 days while the reactor has continued operating normally. Either present me with evidence of actual system failure, or stop undermining exercise operations with constant, pessimistic speculation. Sarah realized that the moment of choice had arrived as she listened to Blake's dismissal of warnings that could prevent nuclear catastrophe. The cooling system leak was accelerating as thermal stress exceeded material limits, and reactor core temperature was climbing toward levels that would trigger automatic emergency shutdown at best or core damage at worst. Her technical knowledge represented the only resource aboard the ship capable of preventing disaster, but using it would require abandoning the anonymity that had protected her for months, the sound of emergency alarms beginning to echo through the engineering spaces marked the transition from potential crisis to actual emergency. Though Blake's initial response was to assume that the alarms represented equipment malfunction rather than genuine system failure, Sarah felt the weight of her hidden expertise pressing against the necessity of continued concealment as thousands of lives hung in the balance. Between her knowledge and her fears of exposure, the USS Constellation was racing toward nuclear catastrophe. While its executive officer refused to acknowledge reality and its most qualified nuclear engineer mopped floors in silence, creating conditions for a confrontation that would test courage, competence, and the true meaning of service above self. The emergency klaxon's piercing wail cut through the USS Constellation like a blade, its urgent rhythm announcing that the theoretical had become terrifyingly real. Sarah dropped her mop as the general alarm echoed through the engineering spaces. Her body responding to emergency protocols burned into muscle memory during years of nuclear training. Around her, reactor technicians scrambled to emergency stations while damage control teams rushed toward the source of rapidly escalating crisis. Chief Patterson's voice crackled over the ship's communication system with the controlled urgency of someone fighting to prevent catastrophe. Engineering emergency, engineering emergency. Primary cooling system rupture in compartment 7 Alpha. All damage control teams to emergency stations. This is not a drill. The hairline crack that Patterson had been monitoring had propagated with devastating speed once thermal stress exceeded critical thresholds, transforming from a minor leak into a major rupture that was dumping reactor coolant into the engineering compartment at an alarming rate. The automatic safety systems that should have initiated emergency reactor shutdown were failing to respond properly, their sensors confused by the unusual failure mode that Sarah's theoretical research had predicted, but that design engineers had dismissed as statistically insignificant. Commander Blake reached the engineering control center within minutes of the alarm, his face showing confusion rather than the decisive leadership required during nuclear emergencies. The complexity of the situation exceeded his superficial understanding of reactor operations, leaving him dependent on technical staff who were struggling to comprehend a failure mode that didn't match standard emergency procedures. Report, Chief. Patterson, Blake demanded, his voice carrying forced authority that failed to mask his underlying panic. The Pentagon officials observing the exercise had been evacuated to safe areas, but their presence aboard the ship meant that any failure would receive immediate scrutiny from the highest levels of naval command. Patterson's assessment was devastating in its technical precision. "Sir, we have a major rupture in the primary cooling loop. Coolant loss is approximately 200 gallons per minute and accelerating. Reactor core temperature is climbing rapidly. We need to initiate emergency shutdown immediately and implement emergency cooling procedures before we lose containment." Blake's response demonstrated every flaw in his leadership philosophy and technical competence. Rather than trusting the expertise of his most experienced nuclear technician, he focused on the political implications of shutting down reactor operations during a high-visibility exercise. "Chief, what's the minimum time required to repair this leak and resume normal operations? We have senior officials aboard who are evaluating our emergency response capabilities." The question revealed Blake's fundamental failure to grasp the severity of the situation. Patterson's response carried the weight of someone who understood that they were minutes away from potential nuclear catastrophe. "Sir, this isn't about repair timelines. We're facing possible core damage that could result in radiation release. We need to shut down now and implement emergency procedures." Sarah stood frozen in the corridor outside the engineering control center, listening to an exchange that crystallized her impossible choice between maintaining anonymity and preventing disaster. Her technical knowledge screamed warnings about the cascade of failures that would follow if Blake continued to delay emergency shutdown procedures. The cooling system rupture was creating thermal imbalances that would overwhelm backup safety systems within minutes. Blake's next decision sealed the fate of everyone aboard the Constellation. Instead of authorizing immediate reactor shutdown, he demanded a second opinion from Lieutenant Commander Torres, the engineering officer whose theoretical knowledge couldn't match Patterson's practical experience, but whose officer rank made his opinion more politically acceptable. "Torres, I need your assessment of the situation. Are we looking at a genuine emergency that requires reactor shutdown, or can we manage this problem while maintaining power for exercise completion?" Blake's question was designed to elicit the answer he wanted, rather than the truth he needed to hear. Torres found himself trapped between technical reality and career pressure, his response reflecting the institutional dynamics that prioritized political considerations over operational safety. "Sir, the situation is serious, but might be manageable if we can reduce power gradually while implementing backup cooling procedures. Emergency shutdown would definitely end the exercise and require extensive investigation." Sarah's restraint finally shattered as she listened to Torres' attempt to find middle ground between disaster prevention and career preservation. Her technical training had taught her to recognize the specific failure mode developing in the Constellation's reactor, a cascade that would accelerate beyond control once core temperature exceeded critical thresholds. The ship had perhaps 10 minutes before the situation became irreversible. Walking through the hatch into the engineering control center required every ounce of courage that Sarah possessed, knowing that her intervention would expose everything she had worked to conceal. But the alternative was watching thousands of people die from radiation exposure, while she remained silent to protect her anonymity. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the urgent technical discussions surrounding the emergency response. "The cooling system failure is creating thermal stress patterns that will cause additional ruptures in the secondary loops within the next few minutes. We need to shut down immediately and flood the reactor compartment with emergency coolant." The control center fell silent as every person present processed the impossible reality of a custodial worker providing sophisticated technical analysis during a nuclear emergency. Blake's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching panic as he struggled to comprehend how a mentally unfit maintenance worker could possibly understand reactor operations well enough to offer emergency recommendations. "Chun, what the hell are you doing in here?" Blake's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose authority was being challenged by the most unlikely source imaginable. This is an emergency situation requiring technical expertise, not custodial staff, offering opinions about systems they don't understand. Sarah met Blake's stare with the calm competence of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of crisis. "Sir, I'm telling you that the thermal dynamics of this failure mode will cause cascade ruptures in the secondary cooling loops. The reactor core temperature is approaching the point where emergency cooling will be ineffective." Patterson's weathered face showed growing recognition as he processed Sarah's technical language and the precision of her analysis. Her description of thermal stress patterns matched his own observations, but demonstrated theoretical understanding that exceeded anything in his practical experience. "Ma'am, how do you know about thermal stress cascades in reactor cooling systems?" The question hung in the air as Sarah faced a moment of complete exposure that she had avoided for months. Her response would either save thousands of lives or confirm Blake's assessment of her mental instability, with no middle ground possible between vindication and destruction. "Because I designed the thermal monitoring protocols for these reactor systems," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years of hidden expertise. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, former nuclear propulsion officer, and I'm telling you that we have approximately 8 minutes before this failure becomes catastrophic." Blake's response reflected his complete inability to process information. That challenged his fundamental assumptions about competence and authority. "That's impossible. You're a mentally unfit custodial worker with psychiatric problems. Guards, remove this woman from the control center immediately." Chief Patterson stepped between Sarah and the approaching security personnel, his instincts recognizing authentic expertise regardless of its source. "Sir, she just provided technical analysis that matches everything I've been observing. If she designed these systems, we need to listen to her recommendations." Sarah's hands moved toward the emergency shutdown controls with the confidence of someone who had operated identical systems thousands of times during her career as a nuclear officer. "Chief Patterson, initiate emergency reactor shutdown now. Commander Torres, activate the emergency core cooling system and prepare to flood the reactor compartment. We have maybe 5 minutes before the secondary loops rupture." The accuracy of Sarah's predictions became evident as alarms began sounding throughout the engineering spaces, indicating that cooling system failures were spreading exactly as she had warned. The reactor core temperature was climbing toward levels that would trigger automatic safety systems if they functioned properly. But the unusual failure mode was confusing sensors and preventing normal emergency responses. Blake's attempt to regain control of the situation revealed his complete disconnection from technical reality. "I will not authorize reactor shutdown based on the recommendations of mentally unstable personnel. Security, arrest this woman for interfering with emergency operations." Sarah's response cut through Blake's denial with surgical precision. "Sir, look at your temperature readings. Look at the pressure drop rates. Look at the thermal stress indicators that are redlining across every monitor in this control center. This is exactly the failure mode I predicted in my doctoral dissertation on reactor safety systems." The moment of truth arrived as secondary cooling loop alarms began screaming throughout the ship, confirming Sarah's predictions with terrifying accuracy. Chief Patterson made the decision that saved thousands of lives, reaching past Blake to initiate emergency reactor shutdown procedures while Sarah activated backup cooling systems with the smooth precision of someone who understood every aspect of their operation. Blake's authority crumbled as the technical crisis overwhelmed his ability to maintain control through bureaucratic procedures. The emergency response required exactly the kind of expertise he had spent his career dismissing, and his attempts to assert command authority became increasingly irrelevant as reactor safety systems responded to operator inputs from the most qualified nuclear engineer aboard the ship, Sarah's hands flew across control panels with practiced efficiency, her movements guided by theoretical knowledge and practical experience that exceeded anything available to the ship's regular technical staff. She implemented emergency cooling procedures that weren't included in standard protocols, innovations based on research that had been classified at the highest levels of naval nuclear operations. The USS Constellation's reactor achieved safe shutdown. With less than 2 minutes to spare before core temperature would have exceeded safe limits, the emergency cooling systems preventing what could have been the worst nuclear accident in naval history. Sarah's intervention had transformed a certain catastrophe into a manageable emergency, though the full implications of her expertise would require time to process and understand. As the immediate crisis stabilized and emergency systems brought reactor conditions under control, the engineering control center filled with personnel who had rushed to respond to the emergency. Sarah stood quietly beside the control panel she had operated with such confidence, waiting for the inevitable questions about how a custodial worker possessed the knowledge to prevent nuclear disaster. The ghost who had hidden in maintenance coveralls for months had finally stepped into the light, her expertise saving thousands of lives while exposing everything she had worked to conceal. The real test would come not from preventing the disaster, but from surviving the revelation of who she truly was. The engineering control center buzzed with controlled chaos as damage control teams worked to stabilize the Constellation's reactor systems, but all eyes remained fixed on the woman in custodial coveralls who had just prevented nuclear catastrophe through expertise that defied every assumption about her identity and capabilities. Sarah stood beside the emergency control panel she had operated with such precision, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline surge that had carried her through the crisis intervention. Captain Reynolds arrived in the control center within minutes of the emergency shutdown, his weathered face showing the grim expression of a commanding officer who understood how close his ship had come to disaster. Behind him followed a convoy of senior staff, Pentagon officials, and naval investigators, whose presence transformed the technical emergency into a moment of institutional reckoning that would reverberate through the highest levels of military command. "Chief Patterson, report," Reynolds commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years managing naval crises. The captain's eyes swept the control center, taking in the emergency indicators that painted a picture of near-catastrophic failure, averted by margins too narrow for comfort. Patterson's response came with the measured precision of a senior enlisted sailor who understood that his words would be scrutinized by congressional committees and Pentagon review boards. "Sir, we experienced a major rupture in the primary cooling loop that triggered cascade failures throughout the reactor cooling system. Emergency shutdown was initiated just before core temperature reached critical levels." Reynolds nodded grimly, his attention shifting to the technical displays that showed reactor systems slowly returning to safe parameters under emergency cooling procedures. "Casualties, radiation exposure, containment status?" "No casualties, sir. Minimal radiation release contained within the reactor compartment. Emergency cooling systems are functioning normally and core temperature is dropping towards safe levels." Patterson's relief was evident in his voice as he delivered the assessment that marked the difference between manageable crisis and national disaster. The captain's attention finally settled on Sarah, whose presence in the control center during a nuclear emergency raised questions that demanded immediate answers. "Chief, explain why we have custodial personnel in the reactor control center during emergency operations." Patterson's response required careful navigation between loyalty to the woman who had saved his ship and respect for the chain of command that had been shattered by her intervention. "Sir, Petty Officer Chen provided critical technical assistance during the emergency. Her analysis of the failure mode allowed us to implement appropriate countermeasures before the situation became catastrophic." Reynolds studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone trying to reconcile conflicting information about personnel under his command. Her custodial uniform and enlisted rank contrasted sharply with the sophisticated technical knowledge she had demonstrated during the crisis, creating cognitive dissonance that demanded explanation. "Chun, step forward," Reynolds commanded, his tone neutral but carrying undertones that suggested he suspected more complexity than appeared in her service record. "Explain your role in the emergency response and how you acquired the technical knowledge to operate reactor control systems." Sarah faced the moment of complete exposure that she had avoided for months, knowing that her response would either vindicate her expertise or confirm suspicions about her mental stability. The assembled officers, investigators, and technical personnel waited for an explanation that would reshape their understanding of competence, authority, and the hidden capabilities of personnel they had dismissed as intellectually inferior. The training facility buzzed with activity as Sarah conducted her daily tour through simulation laboratories where students worked on reactor emergency scenarios based on real incidents from throughout the nuclear fleet. The exercises emphasized rapid problem identification and innovative solution development, skills that traditional training programs had failed to develop effectively. Students learned to trust their observations and technical instincts, rather than deferring automatically to hierarchical authority. Sarah paused at a simulation station where a former maintenance technician named Rodriguez was diagnosing a complex cooling system anomaly that had stumped several traditionally trained officers. His approach combined intuitive understanding developed through years of hands-on work with formal analytical methods that Sarah's program had taught him to articulate and document. The combination produced insights that neither pure experience nor pure theory could have generated independently. "Rodriguez, explain your assessment of the thermal patterns you're observing," Sarah requested, her teaching style emphasizing the development of confidence and technical judgment that had been systematically discouraged in traditional military training environments. Rodriguez's response demonstrated the transformation that Sarah's program had produced in personnel who had been dismissed as intellectually limited by conventional evaluation systems. "Ma'am, the temperature variations indicate stress concentrations in areas where the monitoring systems have limited coverage. The patterns suggest material fatigue that could lead to failure if operating conditions continue unchanged." His analysis was technically sophisticated and operationally relevant, representing exactly the kind of practical expertise that the Navy needed but had failed to recognize through traditional personnel development approaches. Sarah's program had provided him with frameworks for expressing knowledge that he had always possessed but had never been encouraged to articulate. The success of individual students reflected broader changes in how the Navy approached technical expertise and personnel development. Sarah's emphasis on recognizing capability regardless of its source had influenced promotion policies, assignment procedures, and training curricula throughout the nuclear program. The institutional bias that had nearly caused nuclear disaster was slowly being replaced by merit-based assessment that valued contribution over credentials. Dr. Vance visited the facility regularly to conduct research on the psychological factors that enabled successful identification and development of technical expertise. Her work with program students had revealed that many individuals labeled as underperformers possessed significant capabilities that had been suppressed by institutional environments that discouraged independent thinking and innovation. The research was reshaping military psychology and influencing civilian education programs. Sarah's collaboration with Chief Patterson had produced technical innovations that were being implemented throughout the nuclear fleet, safety improvements that emerged from the combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Their joint publications had become required reading in nuclear engineering programs, demonstrating how effective partnerships could bridge traditional gaps between different types of expertise. The program's impact extended beyond individual success stories to influence broader Institutional culture within the Navy. Commands that embraced Sarah's approaches to expertise recognition were reporting improved operational efficiency, higher morale, and better safety records. The correlation between inclusive leadership and operational excellence was becoming impossible to ignore, even among traditional military leaders who had initially resisted reform. Captain Reynolds, who had been promoted to admiral and assigned to oversee nuclear safety policy, frequently used the Constellation incident as an example of how institutional blind spots could create operational vulnerabilities. His leadership had been instrumental in implementing reforms that created systematic pathways for recognizing and utilizing unconventional expertise, while maintaining necessary military discipline and hierarchy. Sarah's personal office reflected her unique position in military culture, decorated with commendations from grateful commands, alongside photographs of program graduates who had gone on to significant achievements in nuclear operations. The space also contained reminders of her journey from respected officer to psychiatric patient to institutional reformer, including the original psychiatric evaluation that had labeled her technical insights as delusional symptoms. The afternoon brought a visit from Admiral Richardson, who conducted quarterly reviews of the program's impact on fleet-wide safety and operational effectiveness. His support had been crucial for maintaining funding and institutional backing despite resistance from traditional military education establishments that viewed Sarah's approaches as threats to established hierarchies. Sarah, the safety statistics from commands that have implemented your training protocols are remarkable, Richardson observed, reviewing performance data that documented significant improvements in technical problem identification and emergency response capabilities. We're seeing 40% fewer reactor-related incidents and 60% faster emergency response times. The statistics validated Sarah's conviction that expertise existed throughout military organizations, but required different approaches for identification and development. Her success in improving safety outcomes had smote critics and had generated demand for program expansion that exceeded available resources. Sarah's response to Richardson's praise reflected the humility that had characterized her approach to institutional reform, her focus remaining on practical improvement rather than personal recognition. Admiral, the improvements come from recognizing capabilities that were always present. We've just created systems that allow people to contribute their expertise without fear of institutional punishment for thinking independently. The program's waiting list included personnel from every branch of the military and several allied nations. Recognition that Sarah's approaches to expertise development had applications far beyond naval nuclear operations. The international interest had prompted discussions about expanding the program and sharing methodologies with other institutions, facing similar challenges in recognizing and utilizing human capabilities. As Richardson concluded his visit, and Sarah prepared for the evening's advanced training session, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of success and institutional change. The woman who had once defined herself through rank and official recognition had learned that true impact came from creating opportunities for others to discover and develop their capabilities. The program's success represented vindication not just for Sarah's technical expertise, but for her insights about institutional bias and the systematic undervaluation of human potential. Her refusal to accept simple reinstatement had forced the Navy to confront fundamental assumptions about competence, authority, and the recognition of expertise in all its forms. The nuclear crisis that had threatened thousands of lives had become the catalyst for changes that would protect countless more, transforming institutional culture in ways that honored both technical excellence and human dignity. Sarah's journey from custodial worker to safety innovator had demonstrated that true leadership meant creating conditions where everyone could contribute their best capabilities to collective success. The ghost in maintenance coveralls had not only saved lives through her technical expertise, but had illuminated pathways for institutional transformation that would benefit generations of military personnel who possessed valuable capabilities waiting to be recognized and developed. 1 year later, Sarah received a letter that would bring her journey full circle. Lieutenant Amy Martinez, a young nuclear engineer facing psychiatric evaluation after reporting safety concerns that contradicted her commanding officer's assessment, had reached out for guidance. The parallels were unmistakable. Another competent woman, being labeled unstable for possessing expertise that challenged institutional authority. Sarah smiled as she drafted her response, remembering the isolation and despair that had defined her own darkest moments. Her reply included an invitation to visit the Nuclear Safety Innovation Program and a simple message: your worth isn't determined by their recognition. Trust your expertise, stand by your convictions, and know that competence will ultimately prevail over politics. The facility now trained over 200 students annually, with graduates serving throughout the global nuclear industry. Sarah's office walls displayed letters from personnel whose careers had been transformed by programs that recognized expertise regardless of its source. Each success story represented vindication, not just for Sarah's technical knowledge, but for her belief that institutional change required more than individual advancement. As she prepared for another day of training future safety experts, Sarah understood that her greatest victory hadn't been preventing nuclear disaster or achieving personal vindication. It had been creating pathways for others to contribute their capabilities without facing the institutional barriers that had nearly silenced her forever. The custodial worker who saved an aircraft carrier had become something more valuable, a bridge between hidden potential and recognized expertise, ensuring that future crises would be prevented by the collective wisdom of people whose voices had finally been heard. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have accepted reinstatement or chosen your own path? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and transformation inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community, where we explore the extraordinary stories hidden in ordinary lives. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring content, and give this video a thumbs up if you believe everyone deserves recognition for their true capabilities, regardless of their title or position.